Welcome back to Odd Socks. Now, I thought I would do a mid-August tour. We have been harvesting really hard over the last few weeks, regularly picking either our beans, like our runner beans, and even our green beans, which we have harvested quite a lot. These are doing really well too. Now, we grew quite a few different varieties, and as you can see, it goes all the way down. Now, we have extended our poles a little bit for next year's growth because these can definitely grow really tall, and I'll be definitely growing these again for next year. Now, the great thing about these beans that they actually taste really good fresh off the plant, raw. They've got a natural sweetness to it and they really do taste fantastic. And I've got to admit, as I'm harvesting, I'm actually always munching on a bean or two. Now, these have done really well, and they're a lovely purple bean. Unfortunately, if you steam them or boil them or however you cook them, they do lose a lot of their colour. But there is different ways. I like to griddle these and they keep their colour a little bit more. And again, these are really delicious. This year's bean harvest has been exceptionally good, and it is definitely one of the crops that have done really well this year. Now, the runner beans are a little bit late compared to previous years, but that is simply because we planted them very late again this year. Planted them late because, again, we got to the stage where the slugs and snails ate so many of our seedlings at the beginning of the year. But these purple beans, when they're fresh, they have the most beautiful snap, and they are beautifully green on the inside. Now, these are really delicious. And it'll be definitely something I'll be growing again next year. Now, I have harvested many kilos of our beans here that I'm growing along this strip. Now, all these beans are tall beans because the dwarf beans are great, but with all the slugs this year, I'm really glad that I actually went for a taller variety. Unfortunately, here in the UK, if you grow with the dwarf variety, which can have some fantastic harvests, and we definitely have had over the years, but sometimes when it's very wet and cold and they're quite close to the ground, you get a lot more bean damage. Where when it's a bit higher, they're off the ground and less likely to get munched by those slugs, snails and other creatures that love that damp, wet soil. Because let's face it, the UK can be very damp and wet through its growing season. On this plant as well, I've also got borlotti beans. Now these, last year I tried to grow as dwarfs and they had a massive issue of not being able to dry on the plant at the end of the growing season. And in fact, most of them I lost to slugs and snails and damaged, and I think I had about 2 pods, that was it, off about 10 plants. So this is why this year I've grown them a little bit taller. Now, these have grown up and they are draping over the other side. They do need a few more feet of height, and that's why we've added these posts. So for next growing season, we'll add some more chicken wire, some recycled chicken wire. I think we've got some spare stuff somewhere, and it will go along this whole width of this row, giving it an extra maybe 3 feet of height to this growing. Now, because the sun is that way, having this quite high is not going to affect majority of the other growing areas, and it seems to be doing quite well. Now, this is a newer no-dig bed area on our newer side of the plot, and it's done exceptionally well this year with these beans, so I'm really quite pleased with this. And I've got to admit, I'm really excited to be able to harvest, hopefully, if I can get them to dry and to grow and to mature, these borlotti beans to store for our winter soups and stews, because I really do enjoy having something that I can dry out and use from a jar in my kitchen at home. Now, this is my sweet corn that I planted much later than the other harvest, because yet again the slugs and snails decimated so many of my seedlings. These are doing okay. Not the best this year, I will admit, and last year I was walking through swaths of sweet corn here on our plot. I think we've probably got half the amount of what we had last year. Now there's a few half decent cobs on this particular variety, but they're nothing to write home about. But I will give them a chance, see what happens, because it's amazing when plants get to a certain stage how quickly they can develop and form into really tasty fruits and veg. But we're definitely not going to get a crop or a harvest off of these corns anywhere like we did last year. And in fact, we've only just finished some of our sweet corn that we'd put in the freezer from last year. Next year, this area, I'm hoping to do no dig because this little square here, what our corn is on, is not no dig. It is just clay soil and it's incredibly weedy. But one of the ways I've kept the weeds down in this area is with squash plants. Now, as you can see from this area, there is a lot of squash coverage. So the majority of the squashes that you can see here in this mass that goes all the way to the sweet corn, all the way up there, is Crown Prince. Now I planted I think 4 or 5 different plants here for the squash. And we've even got one growing up our squash arch. Now we use these like this as ground coverage to help us maintain and lower the weeds. It also mingles really quite well with our runner beans that we've got growing here, and obviously the sweet corn that you can see that I've just showed you before. Now I have got quite a few Crown Prince squashes and they're looking okay. Now these are never going to get really big, and I don't think Crown Prince does get too big. To be honest, I would rather have a squash that will do 2, maybe 3 meals than to have the giant big ones that you really do struggle to do. Unlike my Pacific squash, which is very big. But that was grown more for fun more than anything else. Now if you're growing squashes, it really can take over. That's why you need the little bit of space for them. But you can train them to go in certain directions as they're growing. You can move the main stem very gently so you don't break it in the direction that you would like it to try and grow. Now I love growing squash plants for ground coverage because it really does help reduce those weeds somewhat. It doesn't eradicate it, and you still have to weed. We still have to get into this tangled mess to pull out certain weeds. But we've got nasturtiums that have self-seeded there. We've got the squashes, we've got the corn, the runner beans. There's a lot going on here in this very small area. Now we have got our curry growing up the squash arch as well. Now I think it was 3, maybe 4 plants that we'd actually got growing up there. Now the crop this year is quite disappointing. I think we've got 3, maybe 4 viable squashes from all those plants. Last year we had quite a lot of curry coming from our squashes. But I really do enjoy the taste. Any squashes that I get off of these, be it the Crown Prince, the curry or the Buttercup, even the Pacific Giant, I'll be really happy with this year. Now we did sow spaghetti squash and we did sow butternut squash, but to be honest, nothing happened with those. They either failed to germinate or were very slow to germinate, and then once we got them in the ground, they failed to grow. So for this year at least, they are definitely lost crops. So this is our Brassica cage. Now it is quite tight in here with our growth. We've got our sprouts that are going down the middle, and then we've got our purple sprouting that's along the edge there. Now this is just a makeshift to try and protect it as much as possible from butterflies, but butterflies are definitely still getting in. So we do regularly come in here and check the leaves. But what we're finding is the butterflies are actually laying their eggs on the net above. There's no leaves up here, obviously, because it's much too tall for brassicas at the moment at least. They're laying their eggs the eggs are hatching and the caterpillars are actually dropping down below and landing or finding their way onto our brassicas. But this year we have noticed multiple different areas where this is happening, and we've had to remove those caterpillars. So some of the things that have definitely struggled this year is any cabbages that form a tight head. They were perfect in the beginning, but as the season's gone on, they really have been decimated by snails. Now, we did grow some earliest of all cabbages, some greyhounds, and I think there was another one as well, as also our spring greens. Now, our spring greens have been really good this year, but we haven't harvested as many as I was hoping, but I'm going to harvest one of those in a minute. But the greyhounds and the drumheads really have struggled this year. The best of all cabbage was the best out of the tightly packed formed heads, but the spring greens have definitely won me over this year with their lack of issues with pest damage and the ease of them to grow. Now, this cabbage is probably a little bit past it, but it still looks really good. Now, I like to pick my spring greens while they are still quite loosely packed, but this has started to form a little head. Still more than happy to eat it, and in fact people grow it like this a lot. I just prefer the looser, darker leaves in my diet, where my husband definitely prefers the lighter. Now you can see it has started to get munched, and we do come in here quite regularly to take these leaves off, because once they get to a certain stage like that, there are no benefit to the plant, so they do have to be removed. But I'm quite happy with the cabbages that these spring greens are actually producing. And I think for next year, I'm definitely going to do it again. And in fact, I will sow some more in the next few days to go in over winter. And hopefully there'll be maybe enough time to get them to grow and have an earlier crop at the beginning of next year. Now, we've also got some beautiful red cabbages in here. Now, I've only planted a few of the red cabbage, but they're doing quite well. The sprouts and the purple sprouting are doing good too. Now, they are quite close together, and I think we could have done with having a bit more of a space here. But we've only got one Brassica tunnel that we can protect, and I don't want my allotment full of buildings of awful green netting. Next year we're going to fix all this. This is going to be made out of wood going across, and I'm going to invest in some darker coloured netting that will keep the butterflies off. And hopefully, fingers crossed, I can actually get it into one large piece, so I haven't got these little gaps that we're having to fold over or sew up or even cable tie. Now, I grow an awful lot of beetroot each year because we do use an awful lot of beetroot. And the good thing about multi-sowing is that they're generally all ready at different times. Now, I've had some ginormous beets here on our little plot. I have got multiple different areas I've planted with beetroots, and I have got some plants that I need to actually put into the ground, but I think I will put those in either one of the greenhouses or one of the polytunnels to grow over winter, because they don't like frost damage, and I'm not convinced this winter is going to be as mild as previous winters. Now, our outdoor tomatoes, that more and more are starting to ripen. Now, we do actually like to grow our tomatoes outdoors, but to be honest, our best tomatoes by far have always been under cover. This year, our polytunnel toms have been a bit slower, but I do actually think we are going to still get a good harvest. Again, so long as we don't get a really early frost, those tomatoes, we will still get quite a few kilos. Now, we have been harvesting our tomatoes, both indoors and outdoor tomatoes, quite regular over the last 3 to 4 weeks. Now, we've been harvesting these tomatoes both indoor and outdoor. They're great big large basket at a time. probably about 4 or 5 times already so far this year. So we have been harvesting. It's just maybe not as large amount at a time as what we have done in the past. But I do think we will still get quite a few kilos of tomatoes, and we're hoping for at least over 100 kilos, but I don't think that's going to be the case. I think maybe about 70 kilos overall by the time everything is ripe, both inside and out. Now the risk of the outdoor tomatoes is obviously blight, but so far, fingers crossed, we seem to be doing okay. Now these tomatoes here are definitely ripe, and they have got the most beautiful colour. Now growing outdoor toms can be quite risky, but we're always going to do it every year, even though sometimes at the end of the previous year we always say we're not going to. We do always end up sowing. Our tomatoes in a polytunnel are actually doing okay, and they are really flush with tomatoes. We have cut out or removed some of the tomato plants that had the mould on it. It was only ever going to spread to the rest of the crop, so some of them were just far too way gone. And I think now it's probably about 4 or so plants. Now the rest of the plants are looking healthy. Again, there's no sign of any blight here in our tunnel, but the trusses really are full of tomatoes. And as you can see, there are plenty of ripe ones. As you can probably hear, it's a little bit windy, and this skin on this polytunnel, the plastic, is not that tight. But in our polytunnel, things have really started making a big change. But as you can see in the polytunnel, some of these melons are actually getting really quite large. And as you can see, there is no support apart from the plant itself growing up these strings. Now there is a slight change in some of these leaves, and there is a slight change into some of the fruit, which some of it is actually just rotting off. But that's not too much of an issue at this time of year because, to be honest, these things here just need to focus on ripening these particular fruits. Now for next year's growth, I am going to be changing an awful lot in here. I'm going to be having a table coming down the middle just for my chilies, because working at this height, especially with chilies, and trying to run a hose pipe in here to water it without damaging those chilies, it's been a giant pain this year. So I'm going to be growing them on a table about waist height. So as I'm dragging that hose pipe through, I am not damaging all these crops. These beds are going to have a really good topping of homemade compost, because they really do need it. And even though I've had some really good growth this year, I think we can do better. And you find that with no dig beds, the first year that you do it, you do get a good crop. But each year that you do it and you are adding more and more organic matter to your beds, the better that soil will be. So it's definitely an ongoing project. Now the chilies in here I've done okay, but I can't actually do that experiment I wanted. I think there is far too many variables between growing in the ground to growing in these pots. One of those variables is the watering. Now, because of me working the way I'm working at the moment, getting down here to water these pots as regular as what I should be has definitely not happened this year. Some varieties that have struggled in the pots have actually done really well in the ground. So I think next year I will do this experiment again, but I want the condition of this soil to be a lot better for chilies. Because as I explained in the video a little while ago, a lot of this soil is still very clay. There was only a couple of inches of compost on this soil. Now there's nothing wrong with growing in clay soil, but things like chili and pepper plants, they like to freely be able to grow their roots. So this has maybe not been the ideal environment for those chili peppers. So I will be doing the experiment, hopefully better for next year, and see if there is a major difference between growing in these pots and growing directly in the ground. Now I've had a lot of harvest of my chilies and my peppers so far, and where they look a little bit worse for wear, they are still producing really well. Now I have made loads of chili jams, loads of pickled jalapenos, loads of frozen chilies to use in cooking throughout the next year, and the plants are still producing a lot more. Now I want to grow as many as I possibly can because I have loads of recipes I would really like to try. And some of the plants are really prolifically flowering, so I'm really hoping that these will carry on cropping for at least another month, just so I can get the best out of my chili harvest. Now my peppers have done quite well this year, and I have already taken off probably about 20 or 30 peppers. Now these are Capia pointed red peppers, and they taste absolutely beautiful, and I've finally got them to where they're not so much blossom and rot. It was more so at the beginning of the year, but the more I've removed those damaged peppers, the better the crops have been. And these really are a tasty addition to our food, and it's definitely something I'll be growing again for next year. But I'm going to do a video just on my chili peppers very, very soon, and the rest of the polytunnel, because there's a lot going on in here. Probably far too much for this video. Now this is my very little greenhouse, and in fact it feels even smaller this year because we've got our gherkins here that have been producing some fantastic gherkins over the last month or so. And we've also got our Cape gooseberry. Now I have really struggled with Cape gooseberry. Now the seedlings took so long to actually grow or do anything. Now they are actually starting to produce flowers, and in some places a little bit of fruit. Now I'm really hoping to cut this back and to treat it right through the winter months to give it a head start for next year, because it's one of the plants that I know that I enjoy the fruit, and the fruit is incredibly expensive. But to be honest, even though that this is going to have quite a large amount of growth and it could spread from those seeds, I'm happy for it to happen in this greenhouse. I have no major plans for this greenhouse apart from adjusting the soil here in our beds. It grows okay, but it is incredibly small and it feels very, very claustrophobic in here. Eventually I want to get a much bigger greenhouse, but at the moment I'm having to make do with the two smaller greenhouses. The other one mainly for my sowings. But fingers crossed, I may get 1 or 2 fruits off of these plants this year. I don't think I'm going to get much more. So hopefully I can do it right and get them to survive the winter here in the UK. If I can, that will be a really great start for next year's growth. There are lots of other things growing here on our plot as well. We've got the Jerusalem artichokes that we planted up in the winter last year. We have got the buttercup squashes. We've got another patch of corn as well. Never mind the rhubarbs and everything else, which we are now leaving to make sure that they've got enough strength in those roots to keep it going through the winter and hopefully produce a much better crop for next year. Now, when it comes to our rhubarb, which we grew up in a line in kind of a nursery because we did grow it from seed, we are actually going to thin it out and plant some of those plants in different areas around the allotment. We have got plenty of space to put a random rhubarb plant somewhere. Well, that will definitely be a job for the winter, and then we will leave it alone for next year, and hopefully we can crop off it the following year. If we leave a couple of plants in for next year's harvest, we'll leave them in there, and that's something we can definitely harvest from next year. All being well, that it's a half decent crop for next year at least. So that's it for today. It was just kind of a little bit of a look of all the different things. Now we have got planting done, we have got some sowings in, and we have been trying to keep up with the weeds the trimming, and we will be cutting back certain plants. We've been collecting our seeds from the dried peas that we've left in the ground, from our sweet peas that we've left to dry off naturally for next year's crops. Some of the mange too, we've been collecting seeds, and some cuttings that we've actually taken from some of the fruit bushes to help us produce a lot more plants to help us grow here on our allotment. It's not just the planting and the sowing, it is the continuous harvest, it is the blackberry harvest, it is the raspberry harvest, it's the beans, it's the beetroots, and a few other things that we've got going on. August may not be as necessarily as busy as the last few months, but there is still an awful lot to do here on our Odd Socks allotment.